The morning sun broke over the restless waters of the South Pacific. Aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, sailors were already at their stations. The air was thick with humidity and the faint scent of oil and salt. Men leaned over the railings, eyes scanning the horizon while the steady hum of the ship's engines vibrated beneath their boots. The war had entered its most unforgiving chapter. Every sound in the sky, a distant drone, a faint hum, could mean death. Helena had just withdrawn from a night bombardment of Japanese positions on New Georgia. It had been a punishing assault, her 5-inch guns lighting up the shoreline through the tropical haze. Now, as the vessel regrouped with Task Force 67.2, sailors moved with quiet efficiency, cleaning gun barrels, reloading ammunition, and keeping an eye on the clouds. They had learned that Japanese retaliation came quickly and without mercy. At precisely 9:42 in the morning, the radar screens flickered. 4 enemy aircraft had appeared at 20 miles, approaching fast from the northwest. Identification confirmed them as Aichi D-3A dive bombers, known to Allied forces as VALs. The ship's klaxon howled across the decks. Air attack inbound. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crew scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries rotated into position, their steel barrels swinging toward the horizon. The men knew the odds. Conventional gunnery against fast, low-flying bombers was a grim exercise in statistics. For every aircraft shot down, thousands of rounds would be fired, and most would miss entirely. But something different was about to happen that morning aboard Helena. Something no one had seen before in the history of naval warfare. As the bombers began their attack run on a nearby ship, His Majesty's New Zealand cruiser Achilles, Helena's 5-inch guns thundered. Only a handful of shells streaked into the sky. The gunners braced for the familiar disappointment of watching their rounds detonate harmlessly in the clouds. But this time, they didn't have to aim for perfection. The shells knew. Half a mile from their targets, the air around the Japanese bombers erupted with precise, deadly bursts. One plane disintegrated mid-climb, its fuselage torn apart before the pilot could even react. Another burst into flame moments later, plunging into the sea. The remaining 2 broke formation in panic. Silence fell across the ship. Men stared at the smoke trails in disbelief. They had witnessed something that defied the mathematics of their own training. The guns had done the impossible, struck their targets not by luck, but by intelligence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A weapon that had just changed the laws of naval gunnery was one most of the crew couldn't even name. To them, it was just another shell, heavier, oddly balanced, and issued with unusually strict handling orders. But to the small group of scientists and ordnance officers who had labored for months in secret laboratories, it was the culmination of a dream once dismissed as science fiction. The proximity fuse. Inside each of those shells was a miniature radar system, no larger than a man's thumb, capable of sensing when it neared a solid object and detonating automatically at precisely the right distance. For the first time in history, an anti-aircraft gun no longer relied on perfect aim or impossible timing. The weapon could sense its target. And yet, this same revolutionary technology, the one that could triple or even quadruple the effectiveness of every gun on the ocean, had been nearly rejected by the Navy itself. The refusal hadn't come from ignorance. Naval officers were cautious for good reason. Every shell containing a proximity fuse represented an enormous leap in complexity. It had to survive forces greater than 20,000 times gravity the instant it left the barrel. It had to spin at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, endure heat, vibration, and salt air, and still operate flawlessly. If even one malfunctioned and detonated prematurely, it could destroy the gun crew that fired it. But behind those practical fears was something deeper, a question of faith. The Navy had trusted the human eye and instinctive skill of gunners for generations. Could an unseen circuit, humming quietly within a shell, truly do their job better than they could? In an era when computers filled entire rooms and radios still used glowing tubes, The idea of an electronic shell seemed like fantasy. Yet the science was real. It had been born not from a factory or a weapons lab, but from a university physics department. The men behind it weren't soldiers, but scientists, radar specialists, and vacuum tube designers who worked by lamplight in makeshift workshops. Their goal was to create something that could do the impossible: detect a moving aircraft at a distance of several yards, calculate proximity, and trigger an explosion at exactly the right moment, all within a space smaller than a coffee cup. The early prototypes were fragile. Most shattered when fired. Glass vacuum tubes cracked under the crushing acceleration of a naval gun. Electrical connections failed under centrifugal force. Batteries went dead within seconds. Each test failure meant another month of redesign, another team of exhausted engineers soldering new components by hand. But eventually, through stubborn trial and error, they built something that worked, a device that could survive the gun's fury, detect its target by radio reflection, and detonate in mid-air without human input. That morning aboard Helena proved that the impossible was now routine. The gunners didn't need to understand the circuitry hidden inside the shell. They only needed to watch as their enemy's aircraft disintegrated in front of them. What no one aboard that ship could know was that this same technology, now proven beyond doubt, had already been restricted from broader use. Army commanders had requested it for their field artillery units defending against German aircraft in Europe. The Navy said no. The weapon was too valuable, too secret, and too risky to fall into enemy hands. The irony was staggering. A weapon designed to save Allied lives was being withheld from the soldiers who needed it most, and the decision would cost dearly in the months to come. The decision to withhold the proximity fuse from the Army came from the highest levels of naval command, and it wasn't made lightly. At that point in the war, secrecy was survival. If the Japanese or Germans ever recovered one of the shells intact, they could reverse engineer the fuse, develop countermeasures, or even copy it for themselves. To the scientists who created it, that was an unthinkable risk. Yet the frontline soldiers didn't see risk. They saw the empty sky. All across the European front, Allied anti-aircraft units were still fighting the same hopeless odds they had faced since the beginning. Their 90mm guns fired barrage after barrage at fast-moving German dive bombers, but even the best crews rarely achieved a direct hit. Each round relied on a mechanical time fuse, a tiny clockwork device that tried to predict where an enemy plane might be by the time the shell reached its altitude. But the sky was a living thing, and planes didn't fly predictably. If a bomber changed speed or direction, that mechanical timing was useless. The shell would explode too early or too late, bursting into empty air. The soldiers below could only grit their teeth, watching enemy aircraft slice through their fire like arrows through rain. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in a collection of nondescript buildings fenced off from the rest of the world, a small group of scientists and engineers worked day and night to perfect the device the Army still couldn't use. They called themselves Section T. They weren't military men. Many wore thick glasses and lab coats instead of uniforms. But their lab benches were as much a battlefield as any trench. Each prototype they built carried the same urgency, the knowledge that every day of delay meant more lives lost at the front. Inside the workshop, the smell of solder and ozone mixed with the stale aroma of burnt resistors. Wooden crates labelled Ordnance Handle with Care were stacked against the walls. On the workbenches, hundreds of tiny vacuum tubes were being tested by hand, each one inspected under magnifying lamps for imperfections no thicker than a strand of hair. In the beginning, almost everything failed. One fuse might work on the test bench but short-circuit under acceleration. Another might survive being fired but fail to detonate. Some fuses would go off inside the barrel, destroying the gun and killing the crew. The engineers kept going, driven less by patriotism than by obsession. They were trying to make something that had never existed, a machine that could think in mid-flight. The breakthrough came not from a senior scientist, but from a young engineer who refused to accept that vacuum tubes had to be fragile. He began experimenting with different glass compositions, shock-mounting designs, and methods of sealing tiny wires against vibration. After countless failures, he produced a fuse that could survive the acceleration of a naval gun and still function perfectly. The next problem was power. The circuit needed a source of electricity, but a normal battery would be dead before the shell even left the barrel. They needed something tiny, stable, and long-lived. So they designed a miniature reserve battery that remained inert until the shell was fired. The shock of acceleration would break a glass ampule inside, mixing chemicals that activated the cell and generated current. That single idea to create a battery that turned on by being fired made the fuse possible. Soon, the lab's firing range echoed with proof. When the first truly reliable proximity fuses were fired at test drones, the results were astonishing. Shells detonated within yards of their targets. Drones were shredded to ribbons by shrapnel that would have missed entirely just weeks before. And yet, even with this triumph, the Navy's skepticism lingered. Commanders feared that if even one dud fell into enemy hands, it would expose the entire project. So, for the time being, the proximity fuse would remain a naval secret, restricted to shipboard anti-aircraft guns, and only used against the Japanese. The Army's artillerymen would have to wait. At sea, the results were transforming the balance of power. Japanese bombers once attacked in tight formations, confident that only a few would ever be hit. Now, entire squadrons were vanishing under curtains of timed explosions that didn't need to strike directly. Sailors began calling the new shells the smart ones. Some even swore they could feel the difference when they loaded them, the faint extra weight, the tighter balance, the way the fuse seemed to hum faintly, alive. One destroyer captain later recalled, "It was the first time I ever saw the enemy turn around mid-attack. They realized they weren't flying into gunfire anymore, they were flying into something that could see them." By the time the Navy finally declassified limited reports of its effectiveness, the data was staggering. Anti-aircraft accuracy had improved by nearly 400%. Entire task forces that once lost dozens of ships in a single air assault were now surviving with minimal damage. The proximity fuse had quietly become the unseen guardian of the Pacific Fleet. But the scientists of Section T weren't celebrating. They knew that on the other side of the world, in the frozen forests and ruined cities of Europe, Allied soldiers were dying beneath skies they couldn't defend. German 5-1 flying bombs, pilotless weapons packed with explosives, screamed toward London almost daily. Conventional gunfire couldn't stop them in time. British anti-aircraft units fired thousands of rounds for every hit. Entire neighborhoods burned because the shells detonated seconds too soon or too late. The men in Section T pleaded with Washington, "Give them the fuse. It can stop the Vone second." At first, the Navy still refused. The argument was always the same: security. If one proximity fuse were to land unexploded in German hands, the enemy might copy it, or worse, learn how to jam its signal. But that policy didn't last. Eventually, the reports coming out of London made the choice clear. The Vone second were killing civilians faster than the Allies could rebuild. The British had already lost too much, and their gunners were desperate. So, quietly, shipments of proximity fuses were sent across the Atlantic. When they arrived, the effect was immediate. Within days of being issued to anti-aircraft batteries, the kill rate against flying bombs skyrocketed. Guns that had previously managed one hit for every 2,000 rounds now hit one out of every 40. The difference was like night and day. For the first time, the skies above Britain were no longer ruled by the enemy's terror weapons, and for the first time, the proximity fuse's full potential was visible not just to scientists, but to the public. Back in the Pacific, word of the weapon's success reached the Marines on the islands. There, its use was expanded beyond the guns of the fleet. Field artillery units began receiving modified shells fitted with proximity fuses. They were designed originally to detonate near aircraft, but someone had an idea. If the fuse could sense a plane, could it also sense the ground? The experiment was simple. Fire the shell not directly at a target, but over it, and let the fuse detonate automatically when it sensed the earth below. The result was devastating. Instead of burying itself harmlessly into sand or jungle soil before exploding, Each shell burst just a few meters above the ground, scattering shrapnel across a wide radius. Enemy soldiers who had once survived by hiding in foxholes or behind ridges were suddenly vulnerable. Marines later described it as a rain of steel. It changed the way artillery was used forever. By this point, the proximity fuse was no longer just a weapon, it was a force multiplier. One gun crew could now do the work of 10. Every round that exploded near its target instead of in the dirt saved ammunition, time, and lives. The irony was that even as it became the single most effective piece of technology in the war, almost no one outside of a few command circles knew it existed. Its development was classified beyond top secret. The scientists who created it couldn't talk about their work. Soldiers who fired it didn't understand how it functioned, but they trusted it because it worked. When war correspondents asked how the Navy had suddenly become so effective at shooting down planes, admirals would only smile and say, "Better training, better teamwork." They weren't lying, but it wasn't the full truth. The full truth was sealed in crates labelled VT Fuses do not open. In the final months of the Pacific campaign, those crates became the difference between victory and annihilation. Enemy kamikaze pilots willing to die if it meant sinking a ship hurled their planes at the Allied fleet in waves. Each aircraft was a flying bomb, guided by nothing but the pilot's resolve. No conventional defense could stop them all. But proximity-fused shells did. Instead of relying on perfect aim, destroyers and cruisers now filled the air with invisible nets of lethal fragments. Kamikaze planes that might have struck their targets before were torn apart long before they reached the fleet. The weapon the Navy had once refused had now become the savior of the Pacific. When the war finally ended, those who knew the truth called the proximity fuse the second most important technological achievement of the conflict, second only to the atomic bomb. Yet its story remained largely untold. The scientists of Section T quietly returned to their universities. The engineers went back to civilian life. Their laboratories were dismantled, their notes locked away. It would take years before the public learned how close the project had come to being cancelled or how many lives it had saved once it was finally unleashed. One admiral later admitted privately, "If we'd known what it could really do, we'd have armed every gun with it from the start." But history doesn't move in straight lines. Progress is, always chained to fear, fear of failure, fear of discovery, fear of change. The proximity fuse began as a dream the Navy didn't believe in, and ended as the weapon that made believing unnecessary. If you're still watching, you're part of the few who care to understand the science and courage behind what won the war. Hit that subscribe button and tell us, would you have approved the fuse or kept it secret? When the guns finally went silent, the proximity fuse faded into the background of victory. The headlines celebrated the heroes, the soldiers, the admirals, the pilots who had turned the tide. But the tiny device that had made so much of it possible was never mentioned. It didn't march in parades or hang from medals. It couldn't. For the men who had worked on it, that silence was part of the job. They had built something that saved nations, but they couldn't tell anyone how. In the dusty laboratories where the first prototypes had been born, workbenches sat empty now. Oscilloscopes were switched off. Shelves of glass tubes gathered dust. The war had ended, but the legacy of what they had made was only beginning. In the years that followed, the proximity fuse quietly reshaped warfare. It taught armies and engineers a new rule that machines could think faster than humans in battle, that the moment between firing and impact no longer belonged to luck or guesswork, but to circuitry. Every modern smart weapon, every radar-guided missile, every automated defense system, they all trace their DNA back to that fragile glass tube packed inside a 5-inch shell. It was the ancestor of precision. The story of how the Navy first rejected it became, over time, a cautionary tale whispered in engineering schools and defense circles. How an invention dismissed as impossible, too dangerous, too unreliable, had gone on to save fleets and cities. Some of the scientists from Section T were later invited to speak before Congress. One of them stood before a crowd of uniformed men and senators and said quietly, "We didn't build a weapon. We built a question. The question was whether science could outthink chaos, and the answer was yes. His words barely made the newspapers. But among those who understood what had really happened, they carried weight. Because the proximity fuse wasn't just a weapon, it was proof that progress often begins with disbelief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Even decades later, veterans remembered their first time firing it. A gunner aboard a destroyer recalled standing in the spray of the sea, feeling the vibration of his weapon hammering through the deck. He said the sound of the new shells was different, a sharper crack, a distinct tone. You could tell when they were working, he said. The sky would just break apart. He didn't know what was inside the shell. He didn't need to. All he knew was that for the first time, the enemy didn't control the air anymore. Another sailor, older now, remembered retrieving fragments of one of the shells after a battle. He'd found a tiny piece of curved glass inside a sliver, no larger than a thumbnail, and slipped it into his pocket. He carried it for the rest of his life, calling it the smartest piece of glass I ever met. The proximity fuse's power wasn't just in its technology, it was in its timing. It arrived at the exact moment when humanity needed it most, when wars were being fought not only on land and sea, but in the air, a realm where speed and precision decided who lived and who didn't. It gave ordinary gunners the reach of gods. It allowed the sky to be defended, cities to stand, convoys to survive storms of steel. And yet, it was almost never made. The irony remains the same institution that would one day depend on it nearly turned it away. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well to be trusted. That single hesitation nearly erased one of the most important scientific leaps in modern history. After the war, secrecy around the proximity fuse slowly began to lift. Historians finally traced the story from the university labs where it was first imagined, to the naval proving grounds, to the desperate nights aboard cruisers and destroyers where it proved itself beyond all doubt. When the details became public, even the scientists were stunned by the scale of its impact. Some had never known how widely their invention had been used or how many lives it had saved. One physicist wrote in a private letter, "We built it to keep planes away from ships. We never realized it would end up saving cities." But for every scientist who was recognized, there were hundreds who remained unknown machinists, technicians, lab assistants, and field testers whose names never appeared in the reports. They were the quiet ones, the ones who had spent endless nights with soldering irons, calibrating circuits that had to survive the impossible. They were the heartbeat of the project, the invisible army behind the fleet. Today, few remember their names, but every time a radar locks onto a target, every time a guided weapon corrects its own course, their work echoes through it. The proximity fuse changed the very language of warfare. It turned distance into data. It made the unseen measurable, the impossible hittable. And it all began with a handful of people who refused to listen when someone in authority said, "It can't be done." In the end, the story of the fuse isn't about the Navy, or even about the war. It's about faith, not the blind kind, but the kind that believes knowledge itself can be a weapon. It's about engineers who saw beauty in circuits and purpose in precision. And it's about the strange truth that sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones fought with courage alone, but with curiosity, the courage to question what everyone else accepts. If you walked into a naval museum today and saw one of those old proximity shells sitting behind glass, you might not think much of it. It looks ordinary, a grey cylinder, scuffed and dented, the paint faded by salt air. But inside that shell was something extraordinary, a heartbeat made of electricity, a pulse of human genius that once reached out through the sky and said to the chaos of war, "Not today." For every ship that came home, for every pilot who lived, for every city that slept through the night instead of burning under the sound of flying bombs, that little circuit deserves a moment of silence. Not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude, because in the end, the proximity fuse did something no weapon had ever done before. It made humans faster than fear. The question haunted historians and sailors alike. What if the weapon had been accepted from the beginning? What if, instead of secrecy and delay, the Navy had trusted its own scientists and deployed the proximity fuse across every gun barrel the moment it proved itself? To imagine that world is not to rewrite history, but to confront the hesitation that shaped it. Because in the story of this weapon, there lies a pattern older than any war, the pattern of invention meeting fear. When the fuse first came into being, its potential was staggering. It was tested, proven, and praised by every officer who saw it in action. The shells did not miss. They did not depend on perfect timing or lucky angles. They turned mathematics into instinct. A weapon like that could have transformed every defensive ring in the Pacific overnight. Convoys that once sailed blind under attack from Japanese torpedo bombers could have fought back effectively. Imagine the early island campaigns, the first chaotic months when American task forces pushed toward territory where Japanese air dominance was absolute. Ships like the Lexington, Yorktown, and the Atlanta, which fell beneath waves of bombers, might have stood a fighting chance. Each ship lost in those days was more than steel. It was a mobile city of men, each trusting that their guns would keep them alive. Those guns fired thousands of shells, yet for every plane they struck, dozens more slipped through. Had the fuse been approved immediately, each destroyer and cruiser could have multiplied its defensive power without a single extra gun. The same weapon, the same ammunition, but transformed by a mind's decision rather than a machinist's hand. Military analysts after the war calculated that a single ship armed entirely with proximity-fused shells could match the anti-aircraft power of a dozen conventionally equipped vessels. If even a fraction of the Pacific Fleet had been supplied, entire engagements might have ended differently. The carrier battles that defined the early war, those brutal clashes of courage and luck, could have tipped faster and with fewer losses. But that is not what happened. The fear of the weapon's capture, a fear rooted in rational caution, kept it confined to select naval units for months. The logic was clear. If an unexploded shell fell into enemy hands, they might unravel its design. The secret could be copied. The advantage could be lost. What the decision-makers could not see was the price of that secrecy. Every delay carried a human cost measured not in days but in lives. The Pacific was a vast and merciless arena. Out there, secrecy offered no comfort to a ship under fire. The men who faced those attacks would later describe the feeling of helplessness as waves of aircraft came diving out of the sun. Their gunnery was skillful, their courage absolute, but the math was against them. Without the fuse, they were fighting probability itself, and probability rarely misses. It was only when the weapon finally reached the front in full numbers that its true scale of impact became undeniable. The once impossible ratios, 20,000 shells for a single plane, shrank to mere hundreds. What had been desperation became precision, the air above the fleet filled with invisible traps, each shell calculating its own moment of truth. So, what if that transformation had come sooner? Historians have traced the chain of consequence with near-obsessive detail. The early battles that defined the naval war were balanced on a knife's edge. In those chaotic engagements, even a handful of additional hits could change everything. At Midway, for instance, American carriers succeeded by timing, intelligence, and sheer audacity. But they also suffered heavy strikes from enemy dive bombers that penetrated their defences. If proximity-fused shells had been present then, the attacking formations might never have reached release altitude. The outcome, already a victory, could have been an annihilation of Japan's carrier force months earlier. In the Atlantic, convoys faced relentless attacks from aircraft launched from occupied territory. Merchant ships, lightly armed and slow, were the lifeline of Europe. Every ship lost meant less fuel, less food, fewer munitions. The British anti-aircraft guns on those vessels suffered from the same curse they could fire, but they could not connect. Had the proximity fuse been shared across the Atlantic fleets earlier, the Luftwaffe's dominance over the convoy routes might have collapsed before the introduction of long-range escort fighters. The irony is that secrecy meant to preserve an advantage may have prolonged the very dangers it sought to end. It is not a comfortable truth. In war, Leaders must balance fear of loss with faith in innovation. Too much faith and one risks catastrophe. Too little and progress dies before it can prove itself. The Navy's caution was understandable, yet that caution became a mirror of a deeper military instinct, the belief that radical ideas must be contained until tradition is ready to absorb them. In a way, the proximity fuse was not just a technological leap, it was a test of imagination. It asked men raised in a world of mechanical certainty to trust invisible waves of energy, to believe that a shell could think for itself. To them, it was as much magic as science, and magic, in the minds of bureaucrats and admirals, was dangerous. Even after it was proven, many commanders refused to use it outside of naval engagements. The fear of capture loomed over every decision. They imagined an enemy scientist fishing an unexploded shell from the sea, dissecting it, and turning the weapon against them. That scenario never happened. The fuse's internal design was far too intricate, its components delicate enough to self-destruct on impact. Yet, by the time this was accepted, months of hesitation had already passed. If those months had been reclaimed, if production had been scaled immediately, if secrecy had been balanced with trust, the course of the air war could have shifted visibly. The deadly raids on the fleet anchors, the devastating losses of the early Pacific campaigns could have been reduced, not erased, but transformed. This is not speculation for its own sake. It is a reflection on the rhythm of human decision-making under pressure. Invention does not move at the pace of science. It moves at the pace of courage, the courage to act on what is newly possible. The proximity fuse was ready before its time, and the time took too long to catch up. One might imagine an alternate ending, a fleet that faced each attack not with desperate barrages but with calm precision, convoys that reached their ports intact, airmen who never returned from missions because unseen fuses detonated their aircraft before their bombs could fall. The tides of war would still have turned, but perhaps with fewer widows waiting by the docks, fewer telegrams delivered at dawn. When American soldiers finally carried the proximity fuse into ground combat, its effects stunned both allies and enemies. The Battle of the Bulge, that brutal winter campaign, saw its first land deployment. The results were decisive. German infantry advancing under cover of snow were met by shells that exploded not upon impact but above them, shredding formations that had been invisible to direct fire. Veterans would later say that it was the first time they saw artillery behave as though it could think. Had that capability arrived earlier, the siege battles that consumed thousands of lives might have ended differently. Artillery could have broken assaults before they began. Cities might have been spared prolonged bombardment. Even the final offensives, the desperate fights across rivers and mountains, might have ended sooner. The lesson, then, is not one of blame, but of perspective. Every technological revolution meets a moment of disbelief. It is easier to doubt than to risk, but the proximity fuse taught militaries a lesson they would never forget, that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the one the enemy wields, but the one your own command refuses to unleash. After the war, the story of the fuse became a case study in both brilliance and bureaucracy. Military academies dissected its history, not merely for its engineering triumph, but for its moral weight. It became the example professors cited when teaching future officers about innovation, the need to balance caution with conviction. And yet, in the quiet corridors of museums and archives, the fuse sits as something more than a lesson. It is a symbol of the moment when physics caught up with instinct, when the human mind learned to measure time not by seconds but by proximity. In that sense, the what if is not just historical curiosity. It is a mirror for every decision made in moments of uncertainty, every time an idea is born and immediately doubted. The fuse reminds us that progress is not hindered by ignorance alone, but by the fear of what understanding demands. If the Navy had said yes sooner, perhaps victory would have come sooner too. Perhaps some ships would have survived, but perhaps, even then, the deeper victory was something else entirely, the realization that even in war, the greatest battle is fought not between enemies, but between belief and hesitation. And so the fuse remains more than a device. It is a testament to the power of an idea, to the courage it takes to trust innovation, and to the quiet irony that the deadliest weapon of all might be the human mind itself. If the decision-makers had said yes instead of no, the first proof of that choice would have echoed not over the Pacific, but above the fields of Europe. Imagine the scene, a convoy of Allied trucks grinding through a narrow French road, air thick with dust and fear. Overhead, the sound that every soldier dreaded, the whine of a dive bomber locking onto its target. Ordinary flak could fill the sky with smoke, but it rarely touched the aircraft. Timing fuses were crude. A single miscalculation could waste hundreds of rounds. But with proximity fuses in the gunner's hands, every shell would have become a trap. One detonation near a wing, and a Stuka or Focke-Wulf would fall like burning metal. It's not difficult to imagine the shift in morale that would follow. Troops who once dove for cover at every siren would start to stand and fight. Convoys could move in daylight again. Artillery crews, often slaughtered by strafing runs, would live long enough to fight back. The phrase air superiority would lose some of its meaning because ground forces could claim a slice of the sky for themselves. Historians later calculated that for every proximity-fused round used in the Pacific, the number of shells required to bring down an aircraft fell by more than tenfold. Apply that ratio to Europe, and the difference becomes staggering. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding from fuel shortages and pilot losses, would have been shredded even faster. But this hypothetical war, this what-if world, would also test a different kind of courage, the courage to trust innovation over habit. Inside the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, there had always been a debate between the old and the new. The veterans, men who had risen through the chaos of earlier wars, saw untested devices as dangerous distractions. To them, reliability was survival. The scientists and younger officers argued the opposite, that survival itself depended on pushing the boundaries of what seemed impossible. If the fuse had been accepted earlier, perhaps that generational wall would have cracked sooner, not just in the Navy, but across the entire Allied command structure. The war might have shifted into a new phase where scientific innovation became as decisive as troop strength. And the timeline of victory? It might have been shorter months, shorter, perhaps even a year. The skies over London would have cleared of V-1 raids more quickly. The invasion of Europe might have come under safer skies, reducing the number of ships lost to kamikaze-style attacks or dive bombers. In this alternate reality, even small differences multiply. A single convoy arriving intact means more fuel, more food, more ammunition at the front. Thousands of lives, perhaps tens of thousands, ripple outward from that one bureaucratic decision not made in time. The tragedy is not that the Navy said no. The tragedy is why they said no. Fear of failure, secrecy, the old logic of don't risk what already works. The very caution that kept the fleet alive also slowed the advance of a weapon that could have saved far more. Yet within that contradiction lies the deeper story, one not of machines, but of human nature. Armies, like people, fear the unknown. Even in the face of genius, the instinct to protect what's familiar can override imagination. If the proximity fuse had entered combat earlier, it might have reshaped more than battles. It might have reshaped the very relationship between science and command, between those who dream and those who decide. Consider what followed instead. The scientists, disappointed but undeterred, kept testing in secrecy. When the Navy finally approved deployment, the world had already changed. The tide of war was turning, but slowly, painfully. Many ships that might have been saved were already resting at the bottom of the ocean. The irony is that the fuse's first true victory, the defense of ships like Helena and Cleveland, proved not only that it worked, but that it worked too late. It was the perfect weapon delivered into an imperfect moment. In this speculative version of history, with the fuse accepted from the beginning, the Pacific War would have been almost unrecognizable. Carrier groups would have operated with greater confidence, pushing deeper into enemy waters earlier. Kamikaze attacks, those terrifying suicidal dives that came later, might never have reached the level of devastation they did. Every fleet action from the Solomons to the Philippines would have unfolded under a new sky, one in which every bomber's approach carried the silent fear of an unseen defender. The same scientists who once soldered circuits in hidden basements might have witnessed their invention shortening the war they'd never meant to fight. It is tempting to imagine the world that followed such a victory. Fewer widows waiting by the window, fewer folded flags handed to weeping mothers, fewer sailors staring at the sea, wondering if their ship would be next. But this what-if story also carries a warning that echoes far beyond its time. Progress delayed is often progress denied. When institutions hesitate to embrace what they don't yet understand, the cost is measured not in dollars, but in lives. And yet, despite the lost time and the cautious beginnings, the proximity fuse still fulfilled its destiny. Once accepted, it became the quiet hero of the war's final acts, a weapon so transformative that even the enemy could scarcely believe it existed. Captured reports described it as impossible, a phrase that scientists took as the highest compliment. The real legacy of that decision, the one delayed but never denied, lies not only in the battles won, but in the lesson it left behind. Innovation demands risk. Courage isn't just found on the battlefield, it's also found in the conference room, the workshop, and the laboratory. If the Navy had said yes sooner, perhaps the world would have known peace sooner. But even in their delay, they eventually proved something enduring, that when courage and science finally align, the impossible becomes inevitable. If you're still here with us, thank you for watching. This has been the untold story of how one decision almost kept the world from one of its greatest wartime breakthroughs. What other inventions do you think changed history not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who first dared to believe in them? Let us know in the comments below. The screen fades to black, the hum of the ocean returns, and somewhere in that invisible silence between science and faith a fuse still waits to be believed in. When the guns finally went quiet, there was no roar of victory, only the hum of wind and the hiss of cooling metal. Ships drifted under grey skies, their decks scarred and empty, the ocean around them littered with fragments of a war that had nearly devoured the world. Among the wreckage were the tiny remnants of a miracle, twisted bits of copper, shattered glass, and scorched circuitry, the bones of the proximity fuse. Most sailors never saw what was inside those shells. They only saw what they did, the way they turned chaos into control, the way they made the impossible ordinary. To the men who fired them, it was simply a better round. But to the world that followed, it was proof of something deeper that the future often hides in the smallest pieces of invention. If the Navy's first answer had been yes instead of no, history might have recorded fewer funerals, fewer names on marble walls. Yet the meaning of the story isn't in the delay, it's in the redemption. Even when belief came late, it still came. And when it did, it changed the very language of war. The proximity fuse didn't just help win battles, it rewrote how nations thought about technology. For centuries, armies had fought with muscle, metal, and fire. After the fuse, they fought with circuits and calculation. The battlefield had become an equation, a blend of physics, electricity, and human courage. In the decades that followed, the same principles that guided those tiny fuses would guide spacecraft beyond the atmosphere. Engineers who once built them for guns began adapting their logic to rockets, satellites, and navigation systems. What was born to end destruction soon began to guide exploration. And yet, the fuse's truest lesson had nothing to do with engineering. It was about belief that a handful of civilians working in cramped labs could change the fate of navies. Belief that leadership could evolve, that even in the most conservative corners of the military, imagination could still win an argument. Belief that courage wasn't limited to the men who faced gunfire, but also belonged to those who dared to build something new. Every generation faces its own version of that choice. The names change, the machines evolve. But the question remains, will we say yes to what we don't yet understand? The Navy's hesitation wasn't cowardice, it was human. The fear of the unknown lives in every institution, every decision-maker, every mind that balances risk against reward. The proximity fuse is remembered not because it worked flawlessly, but because it worked after doubt. It proved that even when faith falters, truth can still prevail. Today, replicas of those fuses sit in museums, small and unimpressive beside the massive cannons they once served. Visitors walk past them without realizing they're looking at one of the first true smart weapons, the ancestor of every guided missile, every automated defense system, every radar-based safeguard that watches our skies. Each one of those tiny tubes once carried a heartbeat, a rhythm of electrons that could sense its target and decide, in a fraction of a second, when to act. Inside that pulse lived the intersection of science and soul, a human dream encoded in metal and wire. The men who built it never wanted glory. Many never saw combat, never wore uniforms, never stood on a ship's deck under fire, but their fingerprints shaped history just the same. Their courage was quiet, found not in battle, but in persistence. They endured failure after failure, ridicule, rejection, and secrecy. They built hundreds of prototypes that shattered the moment they were fired, and still they kept building. When the world finally caught up to their idea, it called them geniuses, but they were never chasing genius. They were chasing survival. And perhaps that's the real legacy of the proximity fuse. It blurred the line between invention and instinct. It showed that survival isn't only about reacting faster, it's about thinking faster, daring to believe that the invisible can save the visible. Long after the war ended, one of the project's engineers wrote in his diary, "We built something that thought for itself not to kill better, but to miss less." That sentence has echoed through time like the last sound, after a battle soft, honest, and human. If the Navy had said yes sooner, the fuse would have changed the war. But even as it was, it changed the world. It transformed hesitation into progress, fear into faith, and metal into meaning. And in the quiet that followed after the explosions, faded, after the laboratories emptied, after the last shell was fired, there remained only a simple truth. Every great leap in history begins with a question that sounds impossible. Someone, somewhere, has to answer it anyway. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.